Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. President Trump says he has a plan to rule Gaza, but how much is real and how much is fantasy? Let's get to the bottom line. On paper, and to hear U.S. officials talk about the future of Gaza, there's nothing but, quote, peace, stability, and opportunity for the 2 million shell-shocked Palestinians living there. But if you look at the situation on the ground, nothing looks that promising. Israel still controls over more than half of the Strip, still blocks most basic supplies from entering, and still kills about 5 people per day on average. And that's after the ceasefire brokered by Trump last October. Israel's devastating war destroyed most of the buildings, so most people are still living in tent camps, far from having any semblance of normal life. Now the U.S. has created an elaborate structure of not one, but 3 governing bodies for Gaza. A board of peace, which doesn't mention Gaza at all and is chaired by President Trump. An executive board with a high representative for Gaza and a Palestinian National Committee for the administration of Gaza. So what does the U.S. want to achieve, and what's actually doable? Today we're talking with Sharif Abdel Kouddous, the Middle East editor for Dropsite News. Sharif, thank you so much for joining us. Look, I've got a clip from President Trump talking about the new Board of Peace and Gaza. Let's listen.
We're going to be very successful in Gaza. It's going to be a great thing to watch, and we can do other things. We can do numerous other things. Once this board is completely formed, we can do pretty much whatever we want to do, and we'll do it in conjunction with the United Nations, you know?
And I'm just interested from you, is this going to be a great thing for Gaza?
I don't think by any metric it's going to be a great thing for Gaza. You know, what we saw almost looked like a theme park of dispossession for Palestinians in the renderings they showed and so forth. You know, this Board of Peace, first of all, the actual charter of the Board of Peace, there's no mention of Palestine. There's no mention of Gaza. There's no mention of the Palestinian people. There's no mention of the right to self-determination. There's no mention of the right of return. You know, what we do know is that Trump is the chairman of the Board of Peace with emperor-like powers. He can only be replaced if he resigns or if he's found to be incapacitated, but you need a unanimous vote, which is something that is, you know, practically unattainable. He has the exclusive authority to designate his successor, to invite new member states, and to veto any decisions. And no Palestinians are included in the Board of Peace. You know, although Trump did give a spot to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a man who remains under war crimes indictment and is subject to an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court. So you have, you know, this Board of Peace, you have the so-called founding executive board beneath that. Then there's another layer of bureaucracy with something called the Gaza Executive Board, with several of the same members serving in an advisory capacity. We can talk about that later. But then way down at the bottom of the totem pole is something called the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. And this is made up of Palestinian technocrats that are supposed to implement some of these policies on the ground. So this is almost a farcical manifestation of colonialism in the 21st century. It's almost like a parody of a colonial body. You know, if you had presented this a few years ago, you would have been laughed out of the room, except that it's actually real. And then if we look at the, you know, kind of the nuts and bolts of it, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, delivered a presentation at Davos about what he called, you know, the master plan for the redevelopment and so-called reconstruction of Gaza, what he called the new Gaza. And just as a side note, one of the presentation slides included Arabic script that was incorrectly written in reverse. So from left to right, Arabic script is written from right to left, and the letters were disconnected. So it's hard to take these people seriously because, you know, they're really quite buffoonish in some ways. But these are the people in power. These are the people in charge of the greatest, the most powerful military and the biggest economy in the world. But if you look at Kushner's presentation, it included economic zones, industrial parks, and residential zones. And now we actually have a glimpse of what is being planned for these residential zones, and it's truly Orwellian. I think first we have to get a lay of the land of what Gaza looks like now after 2 years of Israel's genocidal assault. So effectively, at the moment, Gaza has been cleaved in half. After October 10th and the so-called ceasefire, Israeli troops withdrew to what's called the Yellow Line, and they occupy over 50% of the Gaza Strip. Now, analysis of satellite imagery by groups like Forensic Architecture, which we have published at Dropsite News, show how Israel is physically altering the geography of the land in that area that it controls. So one thing that they're doing is a lot of construction of military infrastructure and roads. So they appear to be laying the groundwork to establish a permanent presence in more than half of Gaza. They've constructed at least 13 new military outposts since the ceasefire alone. So I think now there's something like 50 military outposts in that area. And they've also expanded a network of roads connecting these military outposts inside Gaza to the Israeli road network and to bases and settlements outside of Gaza in Israel. And so Israel appears to be doing what it usually does, which is establish facts on the ground, which eventually become permanent. We also know from satellite imagery that since December, Israel has been turning the Yellow Line into an actual physical border. So, previously the Yellow Line was only drawn in Israeli maps, or it was delineated by the military's placement of these physical yellow blocks, of which there are at least 38 in Gaza. And in some places, Israel has moved these blocks hundreds of meters further into Gaza, beyond the line marked on Israel's own maps, taking over even more Palestinian land. But since December, Israel has been constructing these large earth berms, large mounds of earth along the Yellow Line. So they're actually creating this physical barrier that cuts off Palestinians from the Israeli-controlled zone and from more than half of Gaza. And then finally, in parallel with the construction of this military infrastructure, Israel has also been engaged in systematic demolition and destruction of Palestinian property across Gaza. It was doing this throughout the 2 years, but it has been really concentrating on it since the ceasefire in this area it controls.
Well, another side of this, which I find interesting, is we're allegedly at the start of phase 2. Part of the deal is the disarming of Hamas. And I think most people don't expect Hamas to disarm. So I'm just wondering, was this deal that was put together, this ceasefire deal, designed to fail so that, in fact, what you just described quite articulately in detail could proceed without any real reverence to the continuation of the Trump deal on Gaza?
I can't think of any ceasefire agreement that Israel has signed in any country that it's been at war with where it has gone past phase 1. And so, in the beginning, we kept hearing how if Hamas returns the Israeli captives and returns the remains of those who were killed, then the war would stop. They have returned every Israeli captive and all the remains through some Herculean effort to find them, despite the fact that there's thousands of Palestinian bodies buried under the rubble that the world doesn't seem to care about. And yet the attacks continue. When we talk about disarming Hamas, Hamas has agreed to hand over its weapons to a Palestinian body, to a Palestinian state. And when we talk about disarmament, let's remember, what weapons are we talking about here? Hamas is fighting with Kalashnikov rifles, assault rifles, and they're repurposing unexploded munitions from the Israeli military in order to make some form of explosives to attack. Disarmament is kind of a fig leaf, and senior Hamas officials have told my colleague Jeremy Scahill when he interviewed them that we have weapons of willpower. This is just the will to resist, and that's what Israel wants to vanquish. Palestinian resistance as a cause and to vanquish the Palestinian cause. So it's not really something that's realistic. And when they say destroy Hamas, Hamas is much more than just its military wing, the Qassam brigades. It's got a social network. It has a large bureaucracy. You can't destroy part of Palestinian society. So I think this is all intended. And then we know now what they're planning, and what they're planning is the privatization of Reconstruction and these new housing communities that are basically the reincarnation of refugee camps to contain and control a new generation of dispossessed Palestinians. And I can talk to you about what these leaked documents show, because they're quite shocking and quite Orwellian. In mid-January, January 14th, the Civil Military Coordination Center, or the CMCC, held a presentation by the Lieutenant Army General, U.S. Lieutenant Army General, who heads up the CMCC, to international diplomats and figures who were there. And it was about this planned community. So the CMCC was established by U.S. Central Command, by CENTCOM, 1 week after the so-called ceasefire went into effect in October. It's housed in this large warehouse-style building in southern Israel, and it involves dozens of countries and organizations and NGOs. And it's supposed to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire. So when they held this presentation for what they called Gaza First Planned Community, that is being built in Rafah, that would house up to 25,000 Palestinians. And we basically obtained leaked documents about this presentation, and they outline an extensive set of policies regarding everything about Palestinian life in this community, regarding municipality, the economy, health, education, law and order. So we can go through some of this. So firstly, it provides a set of criteria deciding which Palestinians should, quote, be invited to live there. And it includes undergoing security vetting to prevent what they called Hamas elements. It doesn't specify how they will define a Hamas element or who will do the security vetting. But historically, all security checks of Palestinians entering or exiting Gaza, for example, are done by the Israeli military. Another of the criteria for which Palestinians should live in the so-called residential zone, they say intact extended families are preferred to enable mutual aid and prevent friction. After 2 years of genocidal war, is there a single intact extended family in Gaza? I mean, it's all couched in this language of erasure of reality. Israel has completely wiped out 2,700 families in Gaza. There are over 6,000 Palestinians who are the sole survivors of their entire bloodlines. So, this is the kind of language of this presentation, this cold bureaucratic language that erases the reality of the genocide. But then the way this will actually work, to enter the zone, Palestinians will have to pass through a security checkpoint, and everyone entering will be registered with biometric documentation to enable them not just to enter, but to move around and to access services. And when we talk about services, these are basics, accessing food and housing. And that registry will be based on Palestinian ID numbers, which are issued by authorities in coordination with the Israeli military. So the Israeli military already has an incredible amount of surveillance and monitoring of Palestinians in Gaza and of the West Bank, but this gives them another level of monitoring through biometrics.
Just to interrupt for a minute, this sounds, if you're going to get the friendly, stable Palestinian, it still sounds like the very top of Palestinian society that they're trying to bring into this, they're going to live in a prison.
Yes, it's effectively a lab for government surveillance. It also brings, for example, economic transactions further under Israeli surveillance. It replaces Gaza's largely cash-based economy with something called electronic shekel wallets. It also, most troublingly, perhaps, it refers to this residential zone as the Emirati compound. It's unclear why that name was chosen. There's an Emirati field hospital nearby. Reporting by The Guardian after Dropside reported on this shows that the UAE will be funding this project. But under the education section of this presentation, it says that they should create a schooling curriculum that, quote, will not be Hamas-based, but will follow culture of peace principles modeled after the UAE. Now, that phrase, a culture of peace, is mentioned in the normalization agreement between the UAE and Israel that was signed in 2020 as part of the Abraham Accords. And since then, the UAE has normalized relations with Israel more than any other Arab country. They have robust trade, tourism, defense, and security cooperation. And so this seems aimed at promoting an Emirati-inspired re-education program to promote the idea of normalization with Israel. This is like the vision that they have of what's to come. These housing zones where Israel and foreign forces have complete economic, social, and security control over this new generation of dispossessed Palestinians who are corralled into these spaces. And then the other half of Gaza, west of the Yellow Line, will be left as a wasteland that is under constant assault and bombardment by the Israeli military, where construction is not allowed, with restricted food aid and life essentials, and people are going to be left to try and barely survive under conditions of genocide. And this is the future that the world is trying to write for Gaza.
It raises the interesting question of what the neighborhood is seeing when they look at all the stuff you just talked about. They're seeing the embedding of facilities and infrastructure, Israeli security forces inside Gaza. They're watching this happen. Egypt, Jordan, the Saudis, UAE, Qatar, everyone in the neighborhood. What is the temperature there? Are they just acquiescing to this vision of Jared Kushner, the Board of Peace, and going to let, as you said, the facts of the ground drive what they eventually accept?
To varying degrees, yes. Israel has not formally, legally annexed the West Bank, but it has, on the ground, it's annexing land every day. It is taking over land. It is dispossessing villages. Between Ramallah and Jericho in the occupied West Bank, there's not a single Bedouin Palestinian community left. They have all been driven out by attacks by soldiers and armed settlers. They're taking land and dispossessing Palestinians every day. And this has been going on for decades, but has been ramped up in parallel with the assault on Gaza. Egypt has been applauded for not opening its borders to allow a mass displacement of Palestinians. But, the government of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, it's not doing this out of any concern for the Palestinian cause or for Palestinians, even though it speaks in that language. It's afraid of having what for them would be a national security catastrophe, to have a mass of displaced Palestinians on their land who could then launch resistance attacks against Israel, like we saw, in decades past in Jordan and in Lebanon and other countries. And, we also, at DropSite, we obtained a leaked draft of the first resolution by the Board of Peace. And it kind of formalizes the hierarchical structure of this body. And it gives the Board of Peace complete legislative, executive, and judicial control over Gaza. So complete control over Gaza. Under the Board of Peace with all these countries, you have the executive board with people like Jared Kushner, Marco Rubio, Tony Blair, open supporters of Israel, not a single Palestinian on it. Under that, you have the Gaza Executive Board, which includes several of these same members, but also includes businessmen with ties to tech, with ties to real estate. And then all the way at the bottom, as I mentioned before, you have this committee of Palestinian technocrats. You also have this, what's called a high representative, who is, going to authorize, direct, and supervise this Palestinian committee. And then supposedly you're going to have some kind of international stabilization force, although there's a lot of trouble getting together of that force. But the text of the resolution says that the stated goal of the Board of Peace is to transform Gaza into a de-radicalized and demilitarized terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to its neighbors. That's the language used in the resolution. And perhaps most troublingly is that it creates eligibility requirements for Palestinians. It bars from participation any individual, it says, quote, have supported or have a demonstrated history of collaboration, infiltration, or influence with or by Hamas or other terror groups. Very vague terms. It doesn't make clear how it's going to make these determinations. But basically, it's creating these eligibility requirements for Palestinians to participate in governance, in reconstruction, in economic development, and humanitarian assistance. And essentially what that is conditioning Palestinians' ability to survive in Gaza on compliance with this plan. And this is all happening with, pretty much the tacit approval of the international community. It also states, the resolution says, no one will be forced to leave Gaza. Those who wish to leave will be free to do so and free to return. But it also makes clear that access to resources, to aid, to political participation is conditional on compliance with what's called the comprehensive plan. And so, again, this is essentially a colonial mandate with a complete set of rules of governance that has complete control that's overseen by a foreign body.
Well, we've heard from many Israeli officials say they want to see Palestinians leave over the Rafah crossing, border crossing, and they want fewer to come back than go. How wrapped up, we've been talking about the Palestinians that they're going to build housing for and stay, but how continuous is the depopulation and eradication strategy that many people believe Israel is engaged in with the much broader Palestinian population?
I mean, I think, it's been clear if you look at Israeli policy in Palestine for decades, it is one of dispossessing the indigenous population of Palestinians, driving them out with slow bureaucratic processes, with genocidal violence now, with apartheid policies. And so this is the ultimate goal. Whether they can achieve it, I mean, there's 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. And what we saw during the genocidal war is that, they want them to leave, but they're not allowing them to leave. The borders were closed to them. So, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, have left. I know there's something like 100,000 in Egypt already from Gaza. But they have also restricted them from leaving and have slaughtered them and made the conditions of life impossible. So we have to see if Rafah opens, how many will be allowed out. And I think there's a definite mix. They've completely destroyed Gaza. So there's many Palestinians that they need to leave. The conditions of life are not there. There's a whole generation. There's no schooling. There's hardly any healthcare. There's no jobs. There's nothing there. So I think many want to leave. But we also saw this incredible testament to Palestinians' attachment to their land. For example, in the January ceasefire, and again in the October ceasefire, once the bombs stopped falling, at least in the Scorched Earth campaign, upwards of 500,000 Palestinians moved back to the north of Gaza. They were driven south, and they moved back north once they were able to, both times in January and in October. So we see this determination by many Palestinians in Gaza to remain on their land. They want to rebuild on the rubble of their homes and to stay there. So we'll have to see what's happening and what's next in this next chapter.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights, Sharif Abdel Kouddous, the Middle East editor for Dropside News. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? President Trump's plan fails the most basic test of any government: consent of the governed. Israel and the U.S. now insist they can impose a post-war order without political representation of the Palestinians. As a general rule, the absence of legitimacy kind of guarantees new cycles of resistance, of instability, and eventually violence. But the world's happy to sweep that under the rug for now. The U.S. and Israel still want to look at Palestine mostly through the prism of security and business, without real efforts to solve the political problems or to seek justice. And while it's great that Arab and Muslim states will be part of Gaza's future, these states can't play an important role if they look like agents of Israel's interests. Sure, it's much better when there's a ceasefire and fewer Palestinians killed on a daily basis. But fundamentally, if deep grievances aren't addressed, we're all doomed to make the same mistakes. Wash, rinse, repeat. And that's the bottom line.